when I, as a black person, am seeing this, I'm just sitting there going like, all right, well, there are people that look like me who are suffering every day. There are people that look like me who are digging cobalt mines and with their bare hands. What's up, bro? Welcome back to Cancel Thoughts. It's your boy Better Days here. Assuming you guys don't live under a rock, you've probably heard by now about the war that's broken out in Israel between the Palestinian people and the Israeli people.
It's absolute chaos.
Now, some people will say it's not the entire Palestinian people, and I would tend to agree just because I think Hamas is what they're coining the terrorist group that's been kind of perpetuating some of these war acts and some of these really unfortunate things that they've been doing. It's been stuff that's a horror to even like witness, let alone be a part of and be actually in the middle of. Now, I want to preface all of my comments in this video by saying if you're one of those people who's coming to this video thinking that you're going to get somebody who's going to be supportive on one side versus the other and say this is the right way and this is the wrong way, you came to the wrong place.
Sorry to disappoint you.
I'm not someone who's well versed in this. And as a matter of fact, I actually really, really hate talking about things like this just because I don't like to talk about things that I'm not a real expert on. But I got a request to make this video, so I'm going to try to honor that request in doing so. Now, from some of the research that I've done, which isn't as extensive as the research that I would have liked to have done for something of this magnitude, I would say that I came back with a lot more questions than I did answers, just because it seems like this has been going on for generations. And the stories that you hear from people, especially people alive now who are on both sides of this coin, are like, well, this is our home because of this, that's our home because of that. And it's like, well, none of these people were alive when this, at the origin of this turmoil and this controversy. So it's kind of like that game of telephone where it's like, okay, who's telling the truth? How has the truth been perversed or changed? A very clear thing is that this is a multi-generational thing, and none of the people who are fighting in it now were born or were alive when the origins of this began.
It's just a fact.
Now, the next thing that I want to talk about was the three most prevalent things really that I found when I was doing some of the research that I was doing on this, which was that religion was basically at the center of this, politics was at the center of this, and financial interests were at the center of this. And colonialism was a little bit like sprinkled in there because colonialism kind of perpetuates the religion that's been kind of prominent in these parts of the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of those individually, and then I'm going to try to tie it in as much as possible. For most people who don't know, religion is essentially, for this region, probably the biggest, most controversial topic because
Christianity, which started as a Jewish sect, ultimately became a dominant religion toward the end of the Roman Empire. In the 7th century came an Arab conquest, beginning the spread of Islam. The Dome of the Rock was built on the ruin of the Second Temple, making Jerusalem the holy city to 3 monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Now, I may have gotten that wrong, so don't like kill me or whatever in this. I'm saying all I know is throughout history, there have been 3 religions that have occupied the space. The Christians are obviously not as big a player and a factor in this region nowadays as it is the Jews and the Islamics. So I'm not even going to really focus on the Christians just because I don't think the Christians care much about what's going on in that region of the world as of right now because they're not directly involved in this war. Now, with colonialism and stuff like that, it kind of
makes things worse and really
muddies the waters a little bit because the history is a little bit skewed because again, we all know the saying is that history is written and told by the winners, and things may have been omitted, things may have been cut out just because they themselves don't want some of the bad things that they may have done to be perpetuated through time.
It's just not a good look.
Now, another aspect of this that I saw was, and it's kind of one of the main criticisms that I have of religion, is kind of the isomorphic aspects to all these religions. And because
they're all saying the same things,
the main sticking point that I've seen in this controversy essentially is that Jerusalem is the holy land of all 3 of these religions, even Christianity, even though I mentioned that I wasn't going to be talking about Christianity. But Jerusalem is the main sticking point, and it's the holy land of all of these religions. And the war is essentially being fought over who is necessarily going to be the ones who possess that holy land. And one of the things that I find very, very controversial when we talk about religion as a whole is that there are all of these religions that are essentially saying the same thing. And the problem that most people, even atheists, I think will say this, all of these religions are essentially saying some of the same things. They have all of these isomorphic concepts. And how can you claim to be the one true religion when there's this other religion down here who's saying the exact same thing, and they're also claiming the same to be the one religion that is the one that should be followed by humanity? So it's like, are you guys, just a derivative of this other religion that's also telling the truth? Are either of you telling the truth? Who here is to be believed? And you know what the saying is, there's always three sides to every story. There's this side of the story, that side of the story, and then there's the truth, which is at the center of it all, which is usually an amalgamation of the two sides of the stories. But I want to just leave that there for a little bit because I couldn't really conclude who was telling the truth based off of what I saw. Now, the second thing that I want to go into is the politics side of it because I think the Israeli prime minister or the president, I'm not too sure yet. I think it's the prime minister, but his name was Benjamin Netanyahu, which is a funny name to me just because as soon as I hear Netanyahu, I'm just thinking about yahoo.com. Listen, I'm not trying to make light of the situation, but that's exactly where my mind goes as soon as I hear his name. But Benjamin Netanyahu has been the Israeli prime minister for a very, very long time. And he's essentially been the longest tenured prime minister throughout their entire history. And there have been recently rumblings about him leaving power. And obviously, once people gain power, people that want power, power becomes corrosive. So he probably isn't trying to give up that power. So there's the aspect of, well, maybe he allowed some of this to happen. Maybe he allowed the Hamas people to perpetuate and essentially move forward with this attack so that he could kind of rally a sense of nationalism around him to support him maybe holding on to power while this war was going on. Now, obviously, there's a bit of a conspiracy aspect to that, so I don't want to get too deep into that, but it's something that's been brought up recently that I've seen. He might not have been paying as much attention as he should have been, and this might have just been a mistake,
if that's what you want to call it.
or it might have been something that was a mistake that he allowed to happen. So there's that aspect to it as well. And honestly, when wars typically happen, most people don't know this, but a great way, especially if you're someone who doesn't want to relinquish power or give up the power that they've accrued over time, is a great way to do that is to start a war. And because the sense of nationalism and the tribalism that comes out as a consequence of that war being started in your country is that they stand behind the person who's leading them. Now, we all know that politics govern our society and finances also govern our society. And especially in America, we all know that the finances have essentially been leading the agenda throughout all of the political moves that have been made. And Joe Biden recently, for most people who don't know, came out in support of Israel. And also, he simultaneously, well, I wouldn't say he's doing it. I really think whoever's pulling the strings are doing it, but they simultaneously also released $6 billion to Iran, who is also just happens to be the major benefactor of Hamas, who is potentially funding this war. So there's that aspect to that too. And I think whenever religion, politics, and also financial interests converge, it's never really a good thing. So we can kind of see, even though they're loosely correlated in certain aspects, some are more correlated to others, but we can essentially see that there's something weird, I would say, going on in in its entire situation, especially in this region of the world, because
they're being taken advantage of.
for as long as I can remember, the Middle East has been a war-torn segment of the world, and it's really been more of a, I would say, cash cow, especially for the term that's been coined in American politics recently, the military-industrial complex, which is it's been a cash cow for them because they like to see war. They like to see war because it's profitable for them. It's something that allows them to sell the weapons of mass destruction that they create, and it's really, really profitable for them. And when you take a look at this map right here, something that when I saw it immediately stuck out to me was like, who in their right mind, especially politically, would agree to dividing up this territory in this way? Because it legitimately, if you look at all of the blank spots and the lack of lines of demarcation that are in this, who would historically agree to essentially having this be the territory? Because this territory, the way it's set up right now, well, the territories, the way it's set up right now, is promoting war. It's always going to be leading to war because there are no clear lines of demarcation in any of what we're seeing here. And again, it's just a little bit weird to me that a scattered map like this can just be agreed to by people, and we don't really know exactly who those people are who agree to these scattered maps, but it's weird to me that that's a bit more of something that we're not touching on. Now, I want to also say this because something that's been bothering me recently is the amount of coverage that this has been getting now. I'm not saying that I'm indifferent to the suffering of other people. I have Jewish friends. I don't necessarily have Palestinian friends, but I have Jewish friends, and I always am sympathetic to the fact that some of the people that I may know may have people who are suffering in this war right now, people who are dying, members of their family, whoever, loosely related. However, I always want to be sympathetic to that. But there's also the part of me that's like, well, I can't be as sympathetic to this. And it always reminds me of this thing that Dave Chappelle once said. And again, I'm not trying to make light of the situation, but he essentially said,
It's wild because I even have insight into how the white community must have felt watching the black community go through the scourge of crack. Because I don't care either. Hang in there, whites.
and I'm inclined to really like empathize with this a little bit just because, as you guys all may know already, I'm African. I'm of African descent, and there are people on my continent on a regular basis who are dying every day. It's a war torn continent, and it doesn't really ever get any coverage. Apparently, that's just something that's supposed to happen in those areas of the world, which again, I don't necessarily like to think about. But for as long as I've lived, essentially, I can basically say that this has been something that's been the case, and it doesn't really get much media coverage. And I'm a little bit upset about this just because when stuff like this happens in Israel, it's all through the media, and I understand why to a degree, just because most media companies are Jewish owned, which may play into why we hear a little bit more about this. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that their coverage of it may be with nefarious reasons or unintentional, but people are more inclined to want to talk about things that affect them a little bit more than they are for things that doesn't affect them directly. So I get that a little bit more, but when I as a black person am seeing this, I'm just sitting there going like, all right, well, there are people that look like me who are suffering every day. There are people that look like me who are digging cobalt mines and with their bare hands.
This is one of the thousands of unregulated, unmonitored mines in the DRC. It's crawling with children, working like modern-day slaves.
Getting all of this cobalt poisoning in Africa just so that you and I can sit on our phones and talk about essentially what we're talking about here, which is like, to me, is just like, all right, I don't necessarily want to see what's happening happen, but I also don't feel as strongly as I could about it just because I don't think it affects me as much as some other people. Which isn't to say that what's going on right now is okay, which leads me to my next point of which, well, this story came out not too long ago, and it's really sad to see. Now, we all know that there are always casualties to war, and that's just a characteristic of war.
And I hate saying that.
But when you see something like this, and granted, it may just be propaganda because when war tends to happen, there's a lot of propaganda out there that's perpetuated through the media to try to create a sense of nationalism, and it may or may not be true. But if this is true, I just want to say this.
Shame on you.
There is a special, special place in hell for anybody who took place in the murdering of babies. I'm I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to say that there's a legitimate, and if you're someone who supports this, who is saying, well, it's okay that this is just a consequence of war, there's all is fair and all that, it's like, no,
You're just as bad.
all is not fair when it comes to the murder of innocent lives who have essentially had their potentialities extinguished prematurely. So to me, it's like, no, I'm not trying to hear anything about, well, this is justified because, well, there's a systematic oppression or a systematic war going on against the Palestinians in their own homeland. I'm like, I get that that may be the case, but when you involve babies, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to hear anything about that. And to anybody who's supporting any of that, you need to reevaluate your priorities and you need to reevaluate yourself as a human being if you think murdering babies is ever okay. Also, what really bothers me about situations like this, especially about people who aren't directly involved in these situations, like I get it if you're a Jewish person or you're a Palestinian person, if you guys have super animosity to this, but what I don't get is how much people who are not involved in this whatsoever have this proclivity to just want to pick a side and assume that the other side is wrong just based off of facts that they've been presented,
Mind your damn business.
even though they never even really question the facts that they've been presented. And to have this idea that the side that you're supporting is right and the other side is just doing this unprovoked just because, well, they're just crazy people to me is just like ridiculous. Things are never that simple. Things are never as cut and dry as they purport themselves to be. So always keep that in mind when you're doing that. Now, in closing, I want to say this. War is an unbelievably terrible thing. From some of the images that we've seen, and I'm going to post some of them in this video, from some of the images that we've seen, war is obviously an unfortunate archetypal characteristic of our civilization and our species overall. And there are always casualties that happen in war, which is why when I see, things like Ukraine happening, things like this now happening, it makes me start to think about just how far this is going to go. It makes me start to think about whether or not I could potentially end up in a situation where I have to also be participating in war. But I also think about whether or not we're in the end times. Now, again, I tend to try to be more of an optimist when I make some of these videos. I tend to try to be more of an optimist in my life overall off camera. But all I can think about recently is just that maybe we are in the end times. There's war breaking out, there's famine breaking out, there's unhappiness and civil unrest breaking out. And all the while, there are people who are being greedy and just trying to make their own money through the process. So I want to end this video by saying this. Keep your families close, keep your loved ones close, and hopefully we get through this turbulent time in our history and move on to the other side more prosperous and more safe than ever before.
Stay free.
Thanks again, guys, for pressing play on this video, and I'll see you guys on the next one. If you liked what you heard today, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. If you didn't like what you heard, thanks for watching the whole video. Consider leaving a comment in the comment section and telling me exactly what you disagreed with. Either way, thanks for joining me on this video, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.